Skavik 9 was a strange place. A rough, forgotten moon on the edge of the galaxy, it was home to smugglers, traders, and the desperate. Its market was as chaotic as the rest of the moon, filled with loud voices and the smell of strange foods from far-off planets. Humans, aliens, and travelers from all over the universe walked through the crowded streets, each with their own purpose. It was a place where you never asked too many questions. If you did, you might find yourself in trouble. Zachary wasn't sure what had brought him to Skavik 9. It wasn't the best place for a man who had just signed up to the Federation's deep space program. But after weeks of travel, the long journey had made him restless. A brief stop for supplies had turned into a few days of wandering through the crowded, dusty streets of the marketplace. His boots crunched on the gravel ground, the noise almost drowned out by the hum of voices around him. He was tired, but there was something about the place that kept him moving, something pulling him deeper into the market. His eyes wandered, scanning the different stalls, the colorful alien goods on display, the strange fruits and fabrics that hung from every corner. Then, something caught his eye. It wasn't the bright, sparkling trinkets or the piles of exotic weapons that drew his attention. It was the group of people standing around a single stall, their voices raised in excitement. Curiosity tugged at him, and he made his way toward the commotion. As he got closer, he saw her. At the center of the crowd stood a woman. No, a girl, though she looked far too wild and dangerous to be called that. She was chained, her wrists bound with thick metal shackles. Her hair, long and black, tumbled around her shoulders in untamed waves, and her eyes, fierce, glowing with an inner fire, burned through the crowd. Her skin shimmered in the sunlight, a strange iridescent blue that seemed to shift like the ocean's waves. Her expression was fierce, defiant, as if she had never known a moment of peace in her life. Around her stood the slavers, their hands on the weapons at their sides, eyes gleaming with greed. The alien vendor in charge of the sale grinned widely, his sharp teeth glinting in the light. He pointed at the girl and shouted to the crowd, "1 credit! 1 credit for the wild alien woman!" Zachary froze. 1 credit? For someone like her? He took a step closer, trying to get a better look. The woman's chest rose and fell with each deep breath, her defiant gaze scanning the crowd. It was as if she knew she was being sold like a piece of meat, but she didn't care. Her pride was too strong, and for a moment, Zachary wondered if it was pride that kept her alive. Come on, who's going to buy her?" The slaver called again, his voice smooth, trying to entice someone to step forward. "She's tough, wild. She'll make a great warrior or servant, whatever you want her to be." Zachary's heart sank. The way they spoke about her, like she was nothing more than a commodity. He could see the anger in her eyes. And something else, too. Something vulnerable. She wasn't a servant. She wasn't some wild animal. She was a person trapped in a cruel situation. Zachary knew he couldn't just walk away. His feet moved before his brain could even catch up. He found himself stepping forward, his hand reaching into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the few credits he had left. Just enough for a meal, just enough for a couple of drinks, just enough for this. The slaver's grin grew wider when he saw Zachary approach. "Ah, human," the slaver sneered. "Do you want her for a pet? 1 credit, and she's yours. You can do with her as you wish." Zachary looked up at the alien. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the slaver pause. "I'll take her," Zachary said, his voice firm. The slaver's eyes twinkled. 1 credit. That's the price, human. Don't try to haggle. You want her? She's yours. Without a second thought, Zachary pulled out the credit chip, pressed it into the slaver's hand, and watched as the transaction was completed. The slaver laughed, a low rasping sound, as he unlocked the chains that held the woman captive. She stood still for a moment, as if unsure of what had just happened. Zachary didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a step back, giving her space, respecting the fact that she wasn't some item to be controlled. The woman's gaze locked onto his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The crowd around them fell silent, watching the unexpected turn of events. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low but clear. "Why?" she asked, her eyes narrowing, studying him. "Why would you do this?" Zachary swallowed, suddenly feeling like he didn't have a good answer. He didn't know her story, didn't understand what had happened to her, but he knew one thing. She didn't deserve to be here, shackled and treated like a piece of property. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I just couldn't let them do that to you." For a moment, she didn't respond, and Zachary wasn't sure what to expect. Would she lash out? Would she run? But she didn't do either. Instead, she stood there, her expression unreadable. "My name's Zachary," he said, hoping to break the tension. "I'm Lyra," she replied, still eyeing him with suspicion. There was an awkward silence between them, and Zachary wasn't sure what to say next. "Come on," he finally said, offering her his hand. "Let's get out of here." Lyra hesitated, studying his outstretched hand. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her grip was strong, firm, but there was something else, too. A hint of trust, barely visible. But it was there. She wasn't sure why this human had chosen to help her, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel completely alone. They didn't speak much as they walked away from the market. Zachary didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing the right thing. And for Lyra, it was the first step toward something new. Something she hadn't known she was even capable of hoping for. Zachary led Lyra through the Federation station, keeping a steady pace as they moved deeper into the large complex. The air smelled of metal and machinery, a reminder that they were in the heart of human civilization, a far cry from the desolate moon they had just left. The station was busy, with people walking past them in a hurry, their faces focused on their own tasks. Yet despite the rush of activity, Zachary couldn't help but notice how out of place Lyra seemed. She didn't belong here, and neither did he. Her eyes scanned the bustling station, always alert, never still. She moved with a grace that only someone who had seen war could possess, fluid, calculating, and ready to react at a moment's notice. Her every movement was cautious, as if expecting danger to leap from the shadows at any given moment. Zachary felt a wave of sympathy for her. He couldn't imagine the kind of life she had lived, but he knew it hadn't been easy. "Where are we going?" Lyra asked, her voice low, her gaze still darting around the station. Zachary hesitated. He hadn't really planned this far ahead. All he knew was that he needed to get her somewhere safe, somewhere away from the slavers who would surely be looking for her. He had a small private quarters on the station, just a place to sleep and rest between his missions. It wasn't much, but it was private, and it was all he could offer. "I have a place," Zachary said, his voice calm. "It's not much, but it's safe. We can stay there for now." Lyra nodded, but she didn't speak. She simply followed him, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. The two of them moved through the station, avoiding crowded areas and sticking to the quieter hallways. Zachary could feel her tension, her unease, and he knew she was likely not used to being in a place like this. There was nothing familiar about the Federation station to her. It was a maze of metal walls and sterile corridors. Everything was controlled, everything was predictable. It was nothing like the rugged, untamed world she had lived on. As they reached a quieter section of the station, Zachary led her into a small door at the end of a hallway. Inside was a small room with a bed, a desk, and a few personal items he had brought with him on his travels. It was nothing special, just a place to sleep when he wasn't on a mission. But it was all he had to offer. "This is it," he said, stepping inside. "It's not much, but it's safe." Lyra stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. She didn't say anything at first, just walked to the far side of the room and leaned against the wall, her posture still tense. "I'll make some food," Zachary said, trying to break the silence. "I have some supplies left. You must be hungry." Lyra didn't respond right away, but after a moment she nodded. "I could eat." Zachary moved to the small kitchenette in the corner of the room, pulling out a few ration packs and some dried fruit. He wasn't much of a cook, but he knew how to make something edible when he needed to. As he worked, he glanced over at Lyra. She was still standing by the wall, her eyes distant, as if lost in thought. For the next few minutes, the room was filled with the quiet sounds of Zachary preparing food. Lyra didn't speak, but she seemed to be watching him, her sharp eyes taking in every movement. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. What had her life been like before the slavers? What kind of horrors had she witnessed? Finally, when the food was ready, Zachary placed a small bowl in front of her. She stared at it for a moment, as if unsure of what to do. Then, without a word, she picked it up and began to eat. Her movements were quick and efficient, almost as if she was starving, but there was something guarded about the way she ate. It was as if she had learned to eat quickly, to take what she needed and move on. Zachary sat down across from her, watching her closely. He had so many questions, but he didn't want to push her. She had already been through enough, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel uncomfortable. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Zachary said softly. "But if you do, I'm here to listen." Lyra didn't respond right away. She continued eating, her eyes focused on the bowl in front of her. Zachary didn't press her, just waited in silence. After a few moments, Lyra put the bowl down and finally looked up at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, something soft, something vulnerable. "You're different," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Most humans, they wouldn't help me. They wouldn't care." Zachary felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want to be different. He just wanted to do the right thing. But hearing her say it made him realize how little he understood of her world, how little he knew about what she had been through. "I don't know why I did it," Zachary admitted, leaning back in his chair. "I just couldn't leave you there. I don't think anyone should be treated like that." Lyra's gaze softened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the room, her eyes scanning the walls as if searching for something. "I've fought in battles," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've lost everything. My people. They're gone. I don't know why you're helping me, but I don't think I can trust anyone anymore." Zachary listened closely, his heart heavy with sympathy. He couldn't imagine losing everything, losing an entire people, an entire world. Lyra had been through unimaginable pain, and the fact that she was still standing, still fighting, spoke volumes about her strength. "You don't have to trust me," Zachary said gently. "But I'm not going anywhere. I won't leave you." For the first time since they had met, Lyra looked at him with something close to gratitude in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. "You're the first one to say that," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe you're right. Maybe I can trust you." Zachary smiled, though it was a small smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time, it felt like they weren't just strangers. Maybe, just maybe, they were on the path to something more. The days that followed were strange. Zachary tried his best to keep things normal, but nothing felt quite the same with Lyra by his side. She wasn't like the other people he had met in his life. She was quiet, distant, but there was something about her that drew him in. He had saved her from the slavers, yes, but he knew she was still carrying the weight of her past, the kind of weight that no one could easily lift. Zachary was no expert in dealing with people who had suffered, but he knew one thing for sure. Lyra needed time. Time to heal, time to adjust, and time to trust again. He couldn't rush it, he couldn't force it, but in the meantime, they had to get out of the station. It wasn't safe for them there, not with the slavers likely still looking for Lyra. Zachary had a ship parked in the lower bay of the station, a small, unassuming vessel that he had used for short trips on his previous missions. It wasn't much, but it would get them out of the system. "Are you ready?" Zachary asked, as he finished checking the ship's controls. His voice was calm, but inside he was nervous. There was no telling what kind of trouble they could run into once they left the station. The galaxy was a vast and dangerous place, and even though Lyra had been through much worse, he couldn't help but worry for her. Lyra didn't say anything at first. She was standing near the entrance of the ship, her eyes focused on something far off in the distance. For a moment, Zachary wasn't sure if she had heard him, but then she turned to him and nodded. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady but flat. It wasn't that she didn't trust him, but the truth was, she had never been in a position like this before. Being on a ship, on the move, was something she had done countless times in the past, but now, with Zachary beside her, it felt different. It felt like she was no longer alone, but it also felt like she had lost control of her life once again. Zachary didn't press her. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, but he didn't push her to speak. Instead, he gestured for her to take a seat beside him in the cockpit. The ship was small, but it had everything they needed for the journey. Lyra sat down quietly, her hands resting on her lap. Her body was still tense, and Zachary knew it would take time before she could fully relax around him. As the ship lifted off, Zachary guided it through the narrow corridors of the station. The engines hummed softly, the ship slowly gaining speed, as they left the station's atmosphere. Lyra stared out the window, watching as the station grew smaller and smaller, swallowed up by the vastness of space. It was a sight she had seen many times before, but this time, something was different. She was leaving something behind, something she couldn't fully understand. Zachary kept the ship steady, his eyes focused on the controls, but every now and then he would glance over at Lyra. He could tell she was lost in thought, her mind far away. He wanted to ask her about her past, about who she had been before the slavers had taken her, but he knew she wasn't ready to share that part of herself. And so, he stayed silent, giving her the space she needed. "We'll find somewhere safe," he said after a while, his voice steady. "It might take some time, but we'll find a place where you can lay low, somewhere you can finally have peace." Lyra turned her head to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Peace," she repeated, almost like the word was foreign to her. "I don't know what that even means anymore." Zachary's heart went out to her. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, to fight for survival every day, to lose everything she had ever known and to be sold like an object. He didn't know how to fix that, but he was determined to help in any way he could. "Maybe you'll find out," he said quietly, his eyes back on the stars ahead. Maybe. Peace isn't about forgetting the past. Maybe it's about finding a way to live with it. Lyra didn't respond, but Zachary could see the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but it was a crack in the wall she had built around herself. And that was something. The journey through space was slow, the ship gliding through the darkness, passing through uncharted sectors and distant star systems. The hours turned into days, and during that time, Zachary and Lyra settled into a quiet routine. Lyra mostly kept to herself, spending her time on the ship's observation deck or in the small living quarters watching the stars as they passed. Zachary, for his part, kept busy with routine tasks, making sure the ship was running smoothly and keeping an eye on the ship's sensors for any signs of trouble. There were moments, though, when Zachary would catch her watching him, her eyes, studying him with that same intensity she had when they first met. He never knew exactly what was going through her mind, but he had a feeling it was more than curiosity. She was a warrior, a survivor, and she didn't let her guard down easily. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon of a distant planet, Zachary sat down across from Lyra at the small table in the ship's dining area. The lights were dim, the stars shining outside the windows like tiny diamonds scattered across the sky. "Tell me about your people," Zachary said softly, breaking the silence. Lyra looked up at him, her gaze sharp. "My people are gone," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "They were destroyed. It's not a story I like to tell." Zachary didn't press her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the memories that she was trying to bury. "I understand," he said gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." For a moment, it seemed like Lyra was going to say something else, but she only nodded and looked away, her eyes returning to the stars outside. Zachary leaned back in his seat, watching her in silence. The journey ahead would be long, and he knew they both had their own battles to face. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. The ship glided through the dark reaches of space, a small speck in the vastness of the universe. Zachary kept his focus on the controls, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming. Lyra had grown quieter over the past few days, retreating further into herself. She had barely spoken since their last stop, and Zachary had learned not to push her. He could see the weight she carried in her eyes, a burden that went deeper than anything he could understand. For the most part, their days followed a quiet rhythm. Zachary would carry out his duties on the ship, maintaining its systems, checking the sensors, keeping watch for any signs of trouble. Lyra, on the other hand, spent her time either in the observation deck, staring out at the stars, or in her quarters, where she seemed to be lost in her thoughts. It was in these moments, when silence filled the space between them, that Zachary felt the distance. Lyra wasn't ready to open up. She had been through too much, seen too many horrors to let anyone in. And while Zachary could feel the spark of something between them, something that might grow into trust or even more, he knew he couldn't rush it. She would open up when she was ready, and not a moment before. One evening, as the soft hum of the ship filled the air, Lyra came into the common area. She moved with the same quiet grace she always had, but there was something different in the way she held herself tonight. There was a tension in her posture, something that made Zachary pause as he looked up from his work. "Zachary," Lyra's voice broke the silence. She said his name with a softness that he hadn't heard before, and he looked up to see her, standing at the doorway, her gaze distant but steady. He set down the tool he had been holding and gave her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe. Then, with a deep breath, she stepped inside. "I think it's time I told you what happened," she said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of reluctance and resolve. Zachary's heart beat a little faster. He had been waiting for this moment, hoping that she would trust him enough to share her story. But at the same time, he knew that whatever she was about to say would change everything. She sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Zachary remained silent, giving her the space to speak. "My people were once a proud race," Lyra began, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "We lived on a planet far from here, a place of peace and strength. We were warriors, yes, but we fought to protect our home, our families. We had honor." She paused, her eyes narrowing as if the memory brought pain. Zachary didn't interrupt. He could see how difficult it was for her to speak about her past. He could hear the rawness in her voice, the memories that she had clearly tried to bury for years. "It wasn't always like this," she continued, her voice low. "There were other races, other planets that envied us. They wanted our land, our resources, our power. They came for us, time and time again. But we stood strong. We fought back. We believed we would survive. We believed our strength would protect us. Lyra paused again, her eyes far away as she relived the memories. Zachary's heart ached for her, for the pain that was so evident in her face. And then, "They came," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "The invaders! They didn't come with an army. They came with lies. They promised peace, offered treaties, and they promised us safety. We believed them. We were naive." Zachary felt a deep sadness in his chest as he listened. He couldn't imagine the betrayal she must have felt, the hopelessness of watching her world crumble. "They turned on us," Lyra said softly. "They betrayed us. They attacked, destroyed everything. Our cities, our homes, our families. They took it all. They didn't leave anything behind, and She stopped, her breath hitching. Zachary leaned forward, his voice gentle. "You don't have to keep going if it's too much." But Lyra shook her head. "No, I need to. I need to tell you." Her fists clenched tightly as she spoke, her knuckles white. "I wasn't the only one who survived. There were others scattered across the galaxy hiding, but they were hunted too. The invaders didn't stop. They came after me, and when they caught me, they sold me to the slavers." She paused, her face a mask of both rage and sorrow. "They didn't care about the people they destroyed. To them, we were just another group of broken beings to be sold, used, and thrown away." Zachary's heart clenched. He could feel the weight of her words, the pain that had shaped every part of her. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a victim of something far larger than herself. And the slavers? He asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. "They kept me for years," Lyra continued, her voice cold. "I was nothing to them, just another tool. But I fought back. I didn't let them break me. Every time they tried to control me, I fought. But in the end, it wasn't about the battles I fought. It was about the fact that I had lost everything, my people, my home, my family." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the unspoken emotions between them. Zachary didn't know what to say. He couldn't take away her pain, couldn't undo the suffering she had endured. All he could do was be there, as a witness to her story, to her strength. "I'm sorry," Zachary said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and then something shifted. The wall she had built around herself seemed to crack, just a little. "It's not your fault," she said quietly, "but thank you for listening." Zachary nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "You don't have to carry this alone. Not anymore." Lyra didn't say anything, but the smallest of smiles tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time, it felt like she was beginning to let him in. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the ship the only sound between them. And though the journey ahead was still uncertain, Zachary knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going anywhere. He had made a promise to Lyra, and he intended to keep it. Days passed, and Zachary and Lyra continued their journey through space, moving further and further from the station where they had once been safe. The ship moved quietly through the endless expanse of stars, and while the two of them had settled into a routine, Zachary couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Lyra had been quieter than usual, and although she had begun to open up to him in small ways, there was still so much she kept hidden. He respected her space, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that danger was still close by. Every time they stopped at a new system to restock or gather information, Zachary would check the sensors and the communication networks for any signs of slaver activity. He had learned quickly that the slavers were never far behind, and the one credit he had spent to free Lyra was a small price to pay for the trouble that it had stirred. As they passed through an uncharted sector, something caught Zachary's attention. The ship's sensors beeped, a subtle but urgent alert that he had learned to recognize over the years. The readings were faint but unmistakable. A ship, a fast one, following their course. He didn't want to alarm Lyra, but his gut told him that they were being tracked. It was only a matter of time before the slavers would catch up with them. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach as he ran the calculations in his head. Lyra had been sitting in the cockpit with him, her eyes scanning the stars outside the window. She seemed relaxed for the first time in a while. But that peace was about to be shattered. "Lyra," Zachary said, his voice calm but serious. "I need you to listen to me carefully." Lyra turned her gaze to him, her sharp eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation in her movement. She had already sensed something was wrong. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone guarded, but curious. "We're being followed," Zachary replied, his fingers flying over the controls as he adjusted their course. "I think the slavers caught wind of where we were headed. We can't outrun them, but we can try to shake them off." Lyra's expression hardened, and for a brief moment Zachary saw the familiar flicker of anger in her eyes. She wasn't scared. She was ready to fight. But he could tell that something inside her had shifted, a fear that she hadn't let herself feel before. "I'm not going back," she said firmly. "I won't be their prisoner again." Zachary nodded, his jaw tightening. He knew she would never allow herself to be captured again. But he couldn't let her do this alone. They had to be smart. He needed to think fast. "We won't go back," Zachary reassured her. "But we need to get to a safer location, one where we can hide until we figure out our next move. I'm going to take us through an asteroid field. There's a small planet on the other side. If we can lose them there, we'll be safe for a while." Lyra stood up, moving to the back of the ship where her weapons were stored. She didn't speak, but her movements were quick, confident. She was preparing for whatever came next. Zachary didn't stop her. She had every right to be ready. He had seen the fire in her eyes before, the fierce determination that had kept her alive all this time. The asteroid field loomed ahead, dark and treacherous. Zachary had been through it many times before, but this time, it felt different. The stakes were higher. Lyra's life, his life, was on the line. As they entered the asteroid field, Zachary's hands gripped the controls tightly. The ship lurched and swerved as rocks of all sizes passed by them at breakneck speed. He maneuvered through the narrow gaps between the floating asteroids, his eyes darting from the sensors to the view outside the window. The follow ship was still there, keeping its distance but closing in fast. Lyra stood behind him, her posture tense. She was watching the surroundings, her eyes sharp as ever. "They're not giving up," she said, her voice low but her focus never wavering. "They'll have to if we get to the planet ahead," Zachary replied, sweat beginning to form on his brow. He wasn't just trying to lose the slavers. He was trying to keep Lyra alive. She had been through too much already, and he wasn't going to let her be taken again. Just as they neared the planet, a warning light flashed on the console. Zachary cursed under his breath. The slaver ship had launched a smaller pursuit craft, and it was heading directly for them. "We're going to have to fight," Zachary said, his voice steady despite the urgency. He didn't want to do this. He wanted to escape. But if it came down to a battle, he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Lyra didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly to the weapons console, her fingers moving like lightning as she activated the ship's defenses. "Let's give them a reason to rethink their pursuit," she said with a grim smile. Zachary felt a surge of pride as he watched. Her. She was ready for this, and she didn't flinch at the thought of combat. The small pursuit craft fired first, a series of blinding laser blasts streaking through the dark space toward them. Zachary swerved the ship sharply to avoid the blasts, his heart racing as he pulled the ship into a defensive position. Lyra fired back, her shots precise and controlled. The slavers were good, but Lyra was better. The first few shots struck the pursuing craft, causing it to veer off course. The slaver ship retaliated, and Zachary had to dive sharply to avoid the impact. He could feel the tension mounting, the pressure building as the battle intensified. Every move had to be perfect. "One mistake and they would be caught. We're almost there," Zachary grunted as he dodged another round of fire. The planet was within range, just a few more maneuvers to go. Lyra's voice cut through the tension. "We can't keep this up much longer." "I know," Zachary said, eyes locked on the view ahead. He had one last trick to play, and it was risky, but it was their only shot. He steered the ship into a dive, heading straight for the planet's atmosphere. The slavers followed closely behind, but they were about to make a fatal mistake. "Hold on," Zachary said as he pushed the ship into a steep, spiraling descent. The slaver ship followed, thinking they could catch them in the atmosphere, but Zachary had something else in mind. With one final move, he activated the ship's cloaking system, blending them with the planet's atmosphere, hidden from view. The slaver ship was forced to break off, unable to track them any longer. Zachary exhaled slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled the ship into a lower orbit, still hidden in the planet's atmosphere. "We lost them," he said, his voice filled with relief. Lyra turned to him, her face hard and unreadable. "For now." "For now," Zachary agreed. And, though they had won this battle, the war was far from over. The slavers would return. But for the moment, they had a brief taste of safety. The days that followed their narrow escape were quieter, but the tension never fully faded. Zachary and Lyra had settled on the planet, a small, rocky world with dense forests and towering mountains. It was far from peaceful, but it was hidden, at least for now. They had enough supplies to last them a while, and they had made camp in a secluded valley, far from the nearest settlement. Zachary had hoped that the slavers might give up their pursuit, but deep down, he knew better. The galaxy was vast, but the slavers were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had her back. Lyra, ever the warrior, had been training herself every day. She had found a quiet spot in the forest to practice her combat skills, her movements sharp and focused. Zachary had watched her a few times, in awe of how quickly she regained her strength. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he couldn't help but admire her resilience. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of purple and the stars began to twinkle above them, Zachary and Lyra sat by a small campfire. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows around them. They had been quiet for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. "We can't stay here forever," Zachary said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, but there was a sense of finality in it. Lyra turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know. They'll find us eventually. They always do." Zachary nodded, his jaw tight. He had hoped they would be able to slip away unnoticed. But the reality was that the slavers would never give up. "We need to fight back. We need to make them understand that we're not going down without a fight." Lyra's eyes flashed with fire, and for the first time in days, she smiled. It wasn't a soft smile. It was fierce, determined. "I've been waiting for you to say that." They both knew what had to be done. The slavers had taken too much from Lyra. Her people, her home, her freedom. And now, they had come for her again. Zachary wasn't about to let them take her without a fight. Over the next few days, they worked together to prepare. They had salvaged some weapons from the slavers' pursuit craft during their escape, and Zachary had been quietly improving their makeshift defenses. They weren't going to be able to take on the slaver fleet, but they could make sure the next ship that came after them would think twice. As the days passed, the quiet tension in the valley grew. Zachary and Lyra knew the slavers would come, sooner or later. But the moment of truth came faster than they had expected. It was late one afternoon when the first sign appeared. Zachary had been out collecting water when he saw the faint outline of a ship on the horizon. His heart sank as he recognized the unmistakable shape of a slaver ship. They had found them. Lyra was already on her feet by the time he returned to their camp. She was ready, her weapons in hand, her stance steady and unwavering. She looked at him, her eyes fierce. "We knew this day would come," she said, her voice low but resolute. Zachary didn't say anything, just nodded. They had a plan, and they had made their peace with the fact that they might not survive this. But they had something the slavers didn't. They had each other. And that, at least, was something worth fighting for. The slaver ship descended from the sky, its engines roaring as it landed a short distance from their camp. Zachary and Lyra moved quickly, taking up positions in the trees that surrounded the clearing. They knew the terrain well, and they had set traps in case the slavers decided to land too close. As the ship's door opened, the slavers began to disembark, their weapons drawn and ready. They were used to hunting, to capturing. They had no idea what they were walking into. The first few moments were tense as Zachary and Lyra watched from their hidden spots. Then, with a signal from Lyra, they sprang into action. The first wave of slavers was caught off guard as they triggered the traps, which sent them tumbling into pits or into nets that had been set in the forest floor. The sound of struggling men echoed through the trees, and the slavers' leader cursed loudly. Zachary and Lyra moved with precision, attacking from different angles. Zachary's shots were quick and accurate, taking down the slavers as they scrambled to regain their footing. Lyra fought like a whirlwind, her movements fluid and deadly, as she took on the enemy with a ferocity that left no room for mercy. They worked together seamlessly, covering each other's backs, anticipating each other's moves. Lyra was the wild force that struck first, while Zachary was the calm, calculated defender who protected their position. As the slavers fell one by one, the leader of the group shouted orders, trying to regroup his men. But it was too late. Zachary and Lyra had already turned the tables on them. "I'm not going back," Lyra shouted, her voice echoing in the clearing. "You'll have to kill me first." Her words were a battle cry, one that resonated deep within Zachary. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for freedom. They had already lost so much, and now they were determined to win. The final slaver, the leader, charged at Zachary with a raised weapon, his face twisted in rage. But Lyra was quicker. She tackled him to the ground, disarming him with a swift move. The leader struggled beneath her, but she held him down, her grip unyielding. "Tell your masters," she said coldly, "we're not their property. We're free." With one final strike, she knocked him unconscious, ensuring that he would never harm anyone again. The fight was over. They had won. Zachary stood over the clearing, breathing heavily, his pulse racing. Lyra was by his side, her face bruised but unbroken. They had done it. They had fought back, and they had won. "Are you okay?" Zachary asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. Lyra looked up at him, her expression hardening. "I'm alive," she said, her voice steady. "That's all that matters." Together they walked away from the battlefield, the slaver, ship abandoned in the distance. They had faced their worst fear, and they had emerged victorious. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, they had hope. And that, Zachary realized, was all they needed.